Good evening and welcome to Bible study for the United Church of Newport for the 25th of August of 2021. My name is the Reverend James Merriam and I am one of the ministers of the United Church of Newport, and so it is my privilege and pleasure to bring you this time of reflection, this time of meditation, this time of devotion where we can dive into a piece of scripture that we otherwise might not be able to. And actually this coming Sunday, worship will be held at the Church's Land in Magoon Park, which is in Newport Center on City Farm Road. We're going to be having the baptism of my little 6-month-old daughter Adelaide. Very excited about that. We have some special music, and of course worship in Magoon Park is always a remarkable and special event. Those things will be a little bit different. We're not going to be doing sort of traditional worship, and we're not going to be diving into the lectionary for this particular week. The lectionary this week sort of takes us in a varied direction. We end up going along these long threads throughout the course of each summer from different ones of the gospel, and then the accompanying scripture can either be long threads through Old Testament stories or sort of matched accompanying stories. But this week's scripture is sort of more in all kinds of directions, in part because there are a couple of really notable and wonderful pieces of scripture that stand alone. And this is sort of an opportunity, I guess is presented this way this week for those who follow the lectionary to sort of to take in all of the breadth and wonder of scripture sort of all at once, because things that are not necessarily talking about the same thing can relate to one another and can help us inspire and understand one another. For the Bible study, instead of trying to do that breadth and relational thing, we're going to dive into specifically one of the most wonderful but also most difficult and most confusing books of Scripture. And to give you a hint, for those who are familiar with the Hebrew breakdown of the Old Testament, we are going to be in the writings. So this is the third and one of the smaller volumes of the traditional division in the Jewish tradition of the Hebrew Bible. This is very much different than how the Old Testament is divided up in usual Christian Bibles, but it's more accurate and more to the sort of understanding of the whole library of work, the huge and broad range of work compiled over the course of 1,000 years that makes up what we call the Old Testament. It's more than a library. It's sort of a compendium. It's a whole a whole sweep of an entire nation and their relationship with God through extraordinary changes and over a broad sweep of time. And no book within that library is quite so distinct, unique, wonderful, and also deeply confusing and cause of more trouble over the centuries of interpretation than what we're going to be reading. Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, depending on which version you're looking at. So we're going to be reading from chapter 2. We're going to start with verse 4 and go through to verse 13, which is a little longer than what the lectionary calls for. And this is a pretty clear example where when the lectionary was composed, when verses were picked out, the verses that were picked out because they were poignant. It was sort of a complete thought, more or less, and they were less likely to scandalize perhaps more conservative congregations. I'm going to read a little bit more than that, and we can perhaps understand why, and you can hear probably the transition to what becomes a little bit more what might be called family friendly. Anyway, this is Robert Alter's near contemporary translation, and we will, just from a couple of years ago, with copious endnotes, but we'll get into that. The Song of Songs, chapter 2. He has brought me to the house of wine, and his banner over me is love. Stay me up with raisin cakes, cushion me with quinces, for I am in a swoon of love. His left hand beneath my head, his right hand embracing me. I make you swear, O daughter of Jerusalem, by the deer or the gazelles of the field, that you shall not rouse nor stir love until it pleases. Hark, Oh, my lover is coming, bounding over the mountains, leaping over the hills. My lover is like a deer or like a stag. Oh, he stands behind our walls, peering through the windows, peeping through the crannies. My lover spoke out and said to me, Arise, my friend, my fair one. Go, for look, the winter has passed, the rain has gone away, buds can be seen in the land. The nightingale's season has come, and the turtle dove's voice is heard in our land. The fig tree has put forth its green fruit, and the vines in blossom waft fragrance. Arise and go, my friend, my fair one, go forth. It's a love poem. It's a wonderful love poem. It's a love poem that is 25 centuries at least old, and yet somehow has snuck through all the censoring, all the restricting, all the difficult times, perhaps in part because it's one book in Scripture that is recognized as metaphor, or has long been recognized as metaphor, and that the specific metaphor of Christ and the church being sort of husband and wife, it makes this ultimately acceptable to maintain in Scripture, though often not a piece of Scripture to crack open very often in certain circles. This is perhaps not the most famous or most notorious. We were really got all squirmy and giggly in confirmation class, if I remember correctly, years ago when I was in confirmation class, when one of the ministers really went ham on some verses from Song of Solomon, but not like that. Not quite like that, but still some good stuff in there. So beginning, we really need to put this poem in context. Song of Songs, Song of Solomon is most likely, and really has to be seen as a pattern, is a song for or is a poem for Passover. So it's for the springtime. It's for the time that parallels, of course, our understanding of Easter, and kind of precedes and anticipates and justifies all the sort of like chick and bunny and flower and egg kind of celebrations that have gone on around Easter. There's this sort of false narrative of them just being co-opted of a particular pagan ritual. That's really actually Victorian romantics diving into their own pagan rituals, the sort of traditional, or the British pagan setup. It's not that the Christians just stole them to try to use them. It's that really it's a pretty universal theme to celebrate springtime. If anything, the Song of Songs can be drawn in parallel with, and especially what we read just now can be drawn in parallel with the song "The Lusty Month of May" from the musical Camelot. Something that's been recognized all the way along. Something that's been recognized really in every culture and in every society. That when winter is over and those first warm days of spring come, the world is just exploding back to life. We celebrate that right around Easter time most often in Vermont, though of course in Vermont it can still be quite a lot of snow at actual Easter time. But during the season of Easter, certainly we see the transformation of the world in just this way, and with the transformation in ourselves and in our communities around us goes along in parallel, certainly. So it's wonderful. It's just great. It's just phenomenal. And I remember specifically, actually, when I lived in Northern California, which has a climate that's a lot more similar to the ancient Near East than Vermont's is. Even it was very early in the year. Actually, there was one year the rains. Well, it was in the midst of drought. The rains basically stopped in January. We'd only had a few weeks really of what would be rains, and there was a mention that the winter is over. The rains have gone before. So this is really a division between dry season and wet season. And in places of the world like this, the wet season is the cold and rainy season, the only time when sort of seasonal rains come through. Other parts of the world, this doesn't translate well. This doesn't work quite so well when it's in fact the hot time, when you have the energy off the water and thunderstorms come through. Places like Florida, the wet season is the summer. Central America, the wet season is the summer. But just makes it a little bit more difficult to understand and recognize. And it doesn't really matter whether there's rain or snow in the winter, really. It's people come out and just celebrate and frolic in much the same way when those rains or those snows have ended. I remember January in California, it was crazy. It was as if the places where you would see nobody, everyone was staying home, and within the matter of a few hours, the sun came out, and suddenly the whole world was full of people just sunning themselves and celebrating and delighting and laughing and playing and, and courting and chasing one another in just the same way that's described in here. Our verses begin with, "He has brought me to the house of wine," and that actually specifically references, as far as we can guess, what inspired this particular poem, and that is, of course, the story of Passover, and perhaps even the sort of mourning or reflecting back, or trying to sort of justify and celebrate the liberation that represented in Passover, and that the liberation that was represented in Passover then meant the 40-year wander in the desert. So this is a poem to make the love of God be and sound better than the plenty, but also the slavery in Egypt. And so what it does is it uses one of the best things that they brought out of Egypt, which was the poetry. The Egyptian love poems have a long ancient tradition. They've been found more and more as more and more archaeology has uncovered more and more of sort of like the everyday rather than just the monarchs, the pharaohs of Egypt. And poems, love poems in Egypt take place by and large in these sort of great feasting banquet halls, these places just like party houses. So we have this house of wine, this sort of party celebration place. And it says, "And his banner over me is love." This adds not only that it's a place of sort of celebration, but also the implication behind banner is that the lover here is actually also a great warrior, is a great conqueror, and the banner over that place would be a point of pride, a point of intimidation to those around, and that especially, but to the lover here, it's a place of inspiration. So this then calls, "Stay me up with raisin cakes, cushion me with quinces, for I am in a swoon of love." Translation that Robert Alter came through to try to come up with sort of this expression of growing, have just so overcome and so delighted with anticipation that she has become weary, she has become tired. And she is anticipating this what is yet to come. "His left hand beneath my head, his right hand embracing me." And then we switch perspective to the other person speaking. "I make you swear, O daughter of Jerusalem, by the deer or the gazelles of the field, that you shall not rouse nor stir love until it pleases." Which really just means that we will wait until the time is right. That sadly we are separated, we are parted. That there's some scorn being labeled upon the one of these two lovers who is waiting for the other. But this is promises made, promises to be kept, laid out by one person for another and reciprocated. What's most interesting about this is, so it says daughter of Jerusalem to identify this kind of with the new order of things in the new world, and distinctly not Egyptian. "I make you swear by the deer or the gazelles of the field." A consistent pattern throughout the Song of Solomon, and certainly a metaphor, but one that's really very direct and very clear about what it's talking about, is that the Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs, presents what would be called a panentheist theology of the world. God is never mentioned, not specifically by name, not really even by allusion, but this ongoing metaphor of nature as panentheist means that the world and nature is in God. It's not the entirety of God, but that we can see much of what God is by looking at the world around us. So this is throughout this metaphor. So there's no mention of God, and this again makes this fertile ground for all kinds of interpretation, almost as much so as the Book of Revelation, which of course uses these powerful metaphors and never mentions the name Jesus Christ ever. But when you don't mention the particular name, you can find Jesus everywhere throughout that particular narrative. And this is the same way. You can find God continuously throughout this poem that is ostensibly or theoretically makes no mention of God and is not about God. Hark, oh my lover is coming, bounding over the mountains, leaping over the hills. This actually gets a funny interpretation because hark means oh listen, and that's a pretty fair translation of what the Hebrew is. That even a very heavy footfall in a mountain or over paths through the mountains would not be able to be heard, would not be loud from very far away. So we have this interpretation, or we have this idea that the lover is coming and singing or shouting or chanting or something, or speaking out, or even it was proposed yodeling, echoing through the hills, or just that there's a lot of noise coming with this person. And then my lover is like a deer or like a stag. Oh, he stands behind our walls, peering through the windows, peeping through the crannies. So again, you have this comparison with nature as being an expression of God, the majestic beauty, both of a big, beautiful deer, the symbol that's been awing people for a long time, coming and finding you wherever you are, but also it literally is this dual interpretation that contrasts it with literally a deer in the headlights, staring, pausing, coming, shouting, and celebrating over the mountains, coming down to the doorstep, and even at the very, very verge, pausing and savoring the moment, but also like just that little bit of uncertainty, that just butterflies in the stomach kind of feeling. And then they at last get back together. My lover spoke out and said, arise, my friend, my fair one, go, for the winter has passed, the rain has gone away, buds can be seen in the land, the nightingale season has come. And the turtle dove's voice is heard in our land. There's a funny little curiosity in Hebrew that was talked about, that this has been interpreted sometimes as buds can be seen in the land, the pruning season has come, and turtle dove's voices are heard in our land, because those two words, pruning and nightingale, perhaps because nightingales are a spring bird, and it's also the pruning, the time for pruning of vines in preparation for the growing season. It's much less beautiful. You can really interpret it either way. It's much less beautiful talking about the pruning season. So let's say the nightingale season. There's talking about grapevines before and talking about birds after. So the thing in the middle could talk about either. So let's say it talks about birds, because that's just nicer. That's just more pleasant, and it flows better in English. The fig tree has put forth its green fruit, and the vines in blossom waft fragrance. Oh, rise and go, my friend, my fair one, go forth. It's a lot of interpretation. If you were to compare this maybe to your version of scripture, then you might find quite a few differences, actually, especially if you were going back a few verses. If you were to look at the King James version, that's one of the, unfortunately, you get a bad limitation from the King James version, because you have to both study ancient Hebrew and you have to study 16th century English. That word order, which is so important in English, has changed somewhat significantly. That what Robert Alter puts as, for I am in the swoon of love, and what we might in contemporary English say, I am lovesick. In the King James version, that particular phrase was switched at the time, and that was, I am sick of love, which we would suddenly have this suddenly complete rejection of the entire premise of this entire book, just randomly thrown in the middle, creating a lot of confusion trying to read that in contemporary English. So just the limitation, just why different versions and translations of scripture can really confuse us, can really illuminate us, and that it's really important to compare one to another if we're going to really, especially, rest a lot of meaning on one particular word or phrase or something like that. Because there are things that are clear, there are things that are highly contentious, and there are things that are really open for interpretation. This Nightingale thing, no one's going to really hang their entire theology based on that one line. But we do have people hanging entire theologies and movements and directing their entire life's work around simple passages like "you must be born again," when that passage, just like really every other, has some degree of interpretation, has a greater level of sort of understanding that can be gone into if we look both into where it came from and what's happened along the way to get us to the interpretation that we're in now. So, altogether, let's go for beauty, let's go for kindness, let's go for happiness, let's go for wonderful, wonderful things. And thanks be to God for all of that. Anyway, have a wonderful week. I'll see many of you on Sunday. Regardless, best wishes. God bless.